I stood in our living room, watching Sarah pack a suitcase that cost more than my monthly take-home pay. She didn't look at me. She looked through me, as if I were a piece of furniture she'd finally decided to replace. "You're a good man, Elias," she said, snapping the locks on the leather luggage. "But good is just a polite word for stagnant. I'm 30. I want to live before I'm too old to enjoy the view." Behind her, leaning against our peeling doorframe, was Julian Vane. He was my CEO, the man whose name was etched in chrome in the lobby of the skyscraper, where I spent 12 hours a day staring at spreadsheets. He looked at our cramped apartment with a mixture of pity and disgust, his hand resting possessively on Sarah's shoulder. "Don't take it personally, champ," Julian said, flashing a smile that had been whitened to a blinding, artificial perfection. "Some people are built to run the race, and others are just there to hand out the water bottles. You're a world-class water boy." I looked at the divorce papers on the table. I looked at the woman I had supported through 3 years of finding herself, while I skipped meals to pay the rent. I didn't tell them that 3 days ago, a courier in a quiet gray suit had sat me down in a private club and handed me a fountain pen. I didn't tell them that my estranged grandfather, a man Julian Vane spoke of in hushed, terrified tones as the ghost of Wall Street, had passed away, leaving me 51% of Global Zenith Group. Global Zenith didn't just own the building. It owned the debt, the equity, and the very soul of Vane Industries. "I understand," I said quietly. I signed the papers. Sarah sighed, a sound of immense relief. "Thank you for not making a scene. Julian has a gala tonight. We really have to go." I watched them leave. I watched the taillights of Julian's silver Porsche disappear around the corner. Then, I picked up my phone and called the one number the courier had left behind. "This is Elias Thorne," I said. "Start the forensic audit of Vane Industries. I want every cent accounted for by Monday morning." The next week was a masterclass in invisible power. I didn't change my routine. I went to work in my battered sedan, sat in my cubicle, and watched Julian parade Sarah through the office like a trophy. She wore diamonds I knew he hadn't paid for yet. He'd likely put them on a company line of credit, confident in his untouchable status. Monday morning arrived with the kind of heavy, gray rain that makes glass towers look like fortresses. Julian had called an emergency board meeting to discuss expansion. He didn't know the emergency wasn't his to declare. I walked into the boardroom at 10:02 a.m. The directors looked up, annoyed. Julian's face turned a violent shade of red. "Thorne? What the hell are you doing? Get back to your desk before I have security throw you out of the window." I didn't move. I walked to the head of the table, the chair that had been left empty for the representative of Global Zenith. "Actually, Julian," I said, sliding a leather-bound folder across the mahogany surface, "I've reviewed the expansion plans and the expense reports. And the $3 million you moved into an offshore account last Tuesday to cover your personal gambling debts." The room went cold. My lawyer, a man who made Julian's legal team look like law students, stepped out of the shadows. "Gentlemen, may I introduce Elias Thorne, majority shareholder of Zenith Group, and as of this moment, your new chairman." Julian reached for the folder, his hands shaking. He looked at the signature of the heir. He looked at me. The bravado vanished, replaced by the hollow, frantic eyes of a man who realized he'd been mocking the person who owned the air he breathed. "Elias, wait," he started, his voice cracking. "The security is already here, Julian," I interrupted. "But they aren't here for me. They're here to escort you out, for cause." The irony wasn't just that he lost his job. It was that Sarah had traded a nobody for a somebody, only to find out that she'd divorced the owner of the world to run away with the man who was about to be evicted from it. As Julian was let out, my phone buzzed. A text from Sarah. I heard there's trouble. I'm so sorry, baby. I made a mistake. Can we talk? I didn't reply. I simply blocked the number and turned to the board. Now, I said, let's talk about the people who actually do the work in this company. The silence was my greatest weapon. Most men, after being humiliated in a break room and handed divorce papers by a wife who had already moved on to their boss, would have burned the bridge. They would have shouted, smashed a window, or made a scene that would be forgotten by the next news cycle. I didn't. I went back to my desk. I even finished my shift. Julian Vane liked to call himself a disruptor. In reality, he was a predator who mistook silence for weakness. For 3 years, I had been the invisible man in his corporate machine, the data analyst, who saw the numbers he thought he'd hidden. When the inheritance from the Zenith Group landed in my lap, I didn't rush to the executive floor to claim my throne. Instead, I stayed in the shadows for another 60 days. I wanted to see how deep the rot went. I hired a team of forensic accountants, men with gray hair and cold eyes who lived for the thrill of a misplaced decimal point. We met in a nondescript office in the garment district, far from the glass towers of Vane Industries. He's clever, one of the auditors remarked, pointing to a screen filled with shell company transfers. He's been funneling the employee healthcare fund into a research and development wing that doesn't actually exist. It's all going toward his estate in the Hamptons and the jewelry he's buying your ex-wife. I watched the data flow. It would have been easy to shut him down then, but I wanted the slow burn. I wanted the kind of justice that is so absolute, it leaves no room for an appeal. I waited until the quarterly earnings call, the day Julian's ego would be at its peak. Sarah was there, sitting in the front row of the auditorium, wearing a white silk dress that cost more than my first car. She looked radiant, the picture of a woman who had successfully traded up. Julian stood on stage, basking in the applause of investors, talking about record-breaking margins and a leaner, meaner company. He didn't notice me slip into the back of the room. He didn't notice the 3 men in suits standing near the exits. And finally, Julian said, his voice booming through the speakers, I'd like to welcome our majority stakeholder representative from Global Zenith to the stage to confirm our new direction. He expected a faceless lawyer. He got me. The walk from the back of the room to the stage was the longest 30 seconds of my life. The room went quiet. Sarah's smile didn't just drop, it evaporated. Julian's hand, reaching out for a handshake, froze mid-air as he recognized the man he had called a world-class water boy only weeks ago. I didn't take the microphone. I didn't need to. I had the screen behind him. With a click of a remote, the slow burn reached its flashpoint. The glossy slides of Julian's presentation were replaced by the forensic audit. Bank statements, wire transfer receipts, and the names of the shell companies flashed in high definition. The gasps from the investors were like a physical wave. Julian, I said, my voice projected clearly through the lapel mic. You spent 10 years building this house of cards. It took me 10 days to find the bottom card. I handed him a folder. It wasn't a divorce settlement. It was a summary of the criminal referral we had filed with the SEC 2 hours prior. I'm not here for revenge, Julian. I'm here for the pension funds of the 3,000 employees you robbed. I turned to the audience. As the new chairman of Zenith, my first act is the immediate termination of the entire executive board for gross negligence. Julian didn't shout. He couldn't. He looked at the screen, then at the exits, and finally at Sarah. She was already looking away, her eyes darting toward the doors, her mind already calculating how to distance herself from a man who was no longer a king, but a liability. The justice wasn't in the firing. It was in the silence that followed, the quiet, clinical sound of a career being surgically removed. I watched them lead him out through the side door. No cameras, no fanfare. Just the cold, hard weight of the facts he couldn't manipulate. I stayed on stage. I had a company to rebuild, and for the first time in years, the numbers finally made sense. The divide between Julian Vane and me wasn't just about money. It was about the ghosts we carried. Julian carried the weight of 1,000 small thefts, stolen credit, stolen time, and eventually stolen futures. I carried the weight of a name I hadn't asked for, and a sense of duty that wouldn't let me sleep. Julian believed that people were fuel. To him, the 3,000 employees at Vane Industries were just a biological cost of doing business. He lived in a world of high-gloss, white and polished chrome, a place where the air was filtered and the consequences of his actions never reached his lungs. He walked through the office like a god among mortals, his arrogance so thick it felt like a physical barrier. He didn't just want Sarah because he loved her. He wanted her because she was another asset to be acquired, a trophy to prove he could take whatever he wanted from the little people. My world was different. It was the gray of the warehouse floor and the smell of industrial grease. I knew the names of the night shift cleaners. I knew that Marcus in logistics was working overtime to pay for his daughter's braces, and that Elena in data entry was 3 months away from a pension she'd spent 30 years building. My integrity wasn't a choice I made for a headline. It was the only thing I owned when I had nothing else. The contrast came to a head in the quiet hours after the inheritance. While Julian was at a rooftop bar in Manhattan, toasted by sycophants, as he explained how trimming the fat, meaning cutting employee benefits, would lead to a record quarter, I was sitting in a dim basement office with a whistleblower named Arthur. Arthur was 70. He had worked for Vane since the beginning. He handed me a thumb drive with hands that wouldn't stop shaking. "He's skimming the pension fund, Elias," he whispered. "It's not just a few dollars. He's gutting the retirement of everyone who built this place to fund his lifestyle." That was the line. In the world of business, there are shades of gray, but theft from the elderly is pure black. When I finally took control of Zenith Group, I didn't spend the first day ordering new furniture or picking out a company car. I spent it with the legal team, drafting the Restoration Act. I used my own inheritance, money I could have used to live a life of leisure, to backstop the pension funds Julian had drained. I moved $40 million of my personal equity into a trust that Julian couldn't touch. The final confrontation wasn't just a boardroom coup. It was a collision of two completely different moral universes. Julian stood there, even after the evidence was presented, trying to bargain. "Elias, be reasonable," he sneered, still draped in that suffocating arrogance. "Everyone skims a little. It's the cost of leadership. I made this company valuable. I deserve a cut." "You didn't make it valuable," I replied, looking at him across the table. "The people who lost their health care so you could buy a second yacht made it valuable. You're not a leader, Julian. You're a parasite." I watched him realize that his charm had no currency here. He looked at Sarah, hoping for a shred of support, but she was already backing away from the black of his reputation, trying to find a white space to hide in. I didn't feel a surge of pride as they led him out. I felt a sense of relief. The divide was finally closed. The integrity that Julian had mocked as weakness had become the very floor I stood on, while the corruption he called strength had become the gravity that pulled him down. In the end, the world wasn't shades of gray. It was as simple as what you're willing to protect when no one is watching. The air in the break room felt like it was being sucked out of a vacuum. 1 minute, I was a man struggling with a jammed vending machine. The next, I was a man without a wife or a job. "Sign it, Elias," Sarah said, her voice a sharp blade that cut through the hum of the cooling fans. She didn't look at the divorce papers. She looked at Julian Vane, who was leaning against the door with the casual posture of a man who had already bought and sold everything in the room. "Don't worry," Julian smirked, tapping his platinum watch. "I'll make sure she's taken care of. Consider this your early retirement. You're fired, by the way. Conflict of interest, you understand. Status, 0. The humiliation was a cold, drenching rain. I signed. I walked out with my dignity in a cardboard box, passing coworkers who averted their eyes like I was a contagious ghost. But as the glass doors of Vane Industries closed behind me, the pacing of my life didn't slow down. It shifted into overdrive. Day 1. I didn't go home to cry. I went to a high-rise office downtown where a man named Mr. Sterling was waiting with a leather-bound ledger. My grandfather's estate wasn't just money. It was a weapon. By noon, I had authorized the Zenith Protocol. Day 3. While Sarah was posting photos of her new penthouse life, my team was deep in the digital guts of Julian's empire. Every hidden wire, every forged signature, every creative accounting trick was being dragged into the light. My status was climbing in the dark, a silent tide rising behind a dam. Day 7. The news cycle began to turn. Rumors of a massive acquisition by the Zenith Group hit the wires. Julian, ever the narcissist, assumed he was the one being bought out for a premium. He spent the day bragging to the board about the multi-billion-dollar windfall he was bringing in. Day 10, the flashpoint. The boardroom doors didn't just open, they were commanded. Julian was at the head of the table, champagne already on ice. Sarah was beside him, draped in silk, ready to celebrate her final ascent. I walked in. No box, no boots, no apology. "Elias?" Julian laughed, though it sounded brittle. "Security must be slipping. You're trespassing, waterboy." "Actually, Julian," I said, sliding into the seat directly opposite him. "I'm the new landlord." Mr. Sterling stepped forward, dropping the acquisition papers onto the table like a gavel. As of 9 a.m., the Zenith Group has executed its controlling interest. Vane Industries is now a subsidiary, and Mr. Thorne is the sole representative of the parent company. The status shift was so violent it felt physical. Julian's face went from a triumphant red to a sickly, translucent white. Sarah stood up, her hand flying to her throat, her eyes darting between the man she'd discarded and the man who was currently losing his kingdom. "This is impossible," Julian stammered, reaching for his phone. "What's impossible?" I countered, leaning forward, "is explaining how you've been funneling employee insurance premiums into your personal offshore accounts. The SEC is in the lobby, Julian. They aren't here for a glass of champagne." In the span of 10 days, the world had flipped. The man who had been fired in a break room was now the man deciding the fate of the industry. The woman who had left for security was now tied to a man facing 20 years in federal prison. As security led Julian out, Sarah tried to catch my eye, her lips parting to form an apology I didn't need to hear. I didn't look back. The pace of the new life I was building didn't have room for a rearview mirror. I had a company to clean, a staff to protect, and a future that was finally moving at my speed. The most brutal part of justice isn't the handcuffs or the losing of a job. It's the silence that follows when the theater of your own ego finally goes dark. For Julian Vane and my ex-wife, Sarah, that clicked the moment the reality of their choices locked into place. Didn't happen in the boardroom. It happened in the cold, empty weeks that followed. Julian had lived his life convinced that people were stepping stones. He believed that if you were loud enough, rich enough, and cruel enough, the world would eventually bend to your will. But as he sat in a sterile legal office 3 weeks after his termination, watching his personal assets being seized to repay the pension funds he'd gutted, he finally realized that the world doesn't bend, it breaks. He looked at the man across the desk, my lawyer, and then at the door, expecting a miracle that wasn't coming. His friends, the same people who had toasted his genius a month ago, now wouldn't even return his calls. He had spent his life building a kingdom out of sand, and I had simply let the tide come in. The psychological collapse was visible in the way his shoulders slumped. He wasn't a titan anymore. He was just a middle-aged man in a wrinkled suit who had lost the ability to intimidate anyone. For Sarah, the clique was even more intimate. She had traded a marriage for a fantasy, convinced that a man like Julian was her ticket to a life that mattered. She had looked down on me because I was simple, because I valued loyalty over luxury. I heard about her final realization from a mutual friend. She had moved into a small, rented studio apartment after Julian's assets were frozen. One evening, she went to a grocery store, the same one we used to visit together when we were counting pennies for rent. She was standing in line, clutching a single bag of generic pasta when she saw a news report on the overhead television. It was an interview with me, the new chairman of Zenith Group, announcing a massive investment in employee well-being and local manufacturing. In that moment, she didn't see a water boy. She saw the man who had the power to change thousands of lives, the man she had already walked away from. The realization hit her that she hadn't left me because I was poor. She had left me because she lacked the vision to see who I actually was. She had traded the sun for a flashlight, and now the batteries were dead. The click was the weight of knowing that every luxury she had ever wanted was now in the hands of the person she had treated like a footnote. The story didn't end with a shouting match or a dramatic reunion. It ended with them sitting in their separate, quiet rooms, haunted by the ghost of a choice they could never take back. Julian had to live with the fact that his greed had made him a pariah. Sarah had to live with the fact that her ambition had blinded her to the very wealth she sought. I didn't need to do anything else. The most effective punishment wasn't my wealth or my success. It was simply leaving them alone with the truth of what they had done. They were forced to watch from the sidelines as the ordinary man they once mocked built the very world they thought they were too good for. The psychological reality of their greed didn't just cost them their money. It cost them the ability to ever look at themselves in a mirror and see anything but the mistake they had made.